If you've bought cocaine in Europe any time in the last 5 years, chances are it's passed through an Albanian organized crime group.
Unë ime lëndër është kokain, lëvizim me kilo. Mund të lëvizim deri në 50 kilo në javë.
I got shot here plenty times. I'm alive. Plenty of my friends, they dead.
Over the past decade, Albanian crime groups have overtaken all rivals to become some of the most crucial players in global drug trafficking. This is how criminal networks from a tiny European country have revolutionized the international cocaine business. Europeans love coke. In fact, in 2021, reports emerged that the European cocaine market had surpassed the US in value for the first time ever.
Stoners, everybody fucking takes Germany. Everybody.
This decade-long explosion in European coke habits has largely been supplied by a relatively new type of trafficker. The highly successful organized crime groups drawn from Albanian communities all over the continent.
We're dragged into it by some Albanians. That's how I got into it first, really.
There's always Albanian gangs about. There's a 24/7 service. You call them up any time of the day. They'll come drop you, just give them an address. It's like McDonald's, but for drugs.
Albania is a small country with a population of under 3 million. For decades, it was ruled by a brutal authoritarian communist regime, which is actually part of the reason it's now become so prominent in international organized crime.
We tended to see that many of the former communist security sectors were made redundant by the state. So they either tended to go into kind of these more informal organizations and networks, or they kind of went into private security provision, which then very easily also become kind of transposed into illicit activities and informal activities.
Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Albania suffered a series of wars and financial crises, which not only flooded the country with weapons, but caused thousands of refugees to flee to the rest of Europe and North America.
Many of these were youngsters. They had family connections back in Albania, which they maintained, and recognizing that it was important for them to maintain those family connections in order to grow as a criminal organization.
Albanian criminal groups have been heavily involved in drug trafficking for decades, largely working with Turkish networks supplying heroin on the route from Afghanistan into Europe. Then, in the 1990s, Albania exploded as a hub for European cannabis production.
Over the years, this once poor, desolate village became a European marijuana bazaar. Absolute mountains of disgusting. Traffickers dealt directly with farmers. Bigger farmers became bigger players. Organized crime moved in.
But what's really set the Albanian organized crime groups apart is how, since around the mid-2000s, they've revolutionized the cocaine trade. Traditionally, the different parts of the cocaine business were kept separate. South American cartels would sell to international traffickers who would smuggle the drug around the world, but would usually sell it on to local criminal groups to distribute on the streets. The Albanians took control of the entire chain. They went out to South America, formed their own contacts with the cartels, and organized transportation back to their own suppliers in Europe, who would distribute the drugs for maximum profit.
So are there Albanian criminal members in Colombia who the clan deals with?
Sí, claro, aquí en Colombia hay albaneses. El estado de la droga que sí sea bien pura. Los albaneses se caracterizan por ser muy sangrientos, ¿sí? Y si alguien se le mete en sus terrenos, ellos acaban con todo lo que haya en el camino. No les importa acabar con una familia completa.
The Albanian supply model has been so successful, and the only way that they would make more money was if they were able to go to the source of the drug. So instead of purchasing these drugs from other drug dealers, they decided that let's move and let's gain those connections with South America and then ship these drugs in. They completely took over the whole drug trade in terms of cocaine.
There'd been a series of high-profile killings and arrests of Albanian traffickers, stretching from Ecuador to New York to the Netherlands. Albanians now make up by far the largest percentage of foreign-born inmates in British prisons. And the EU crime agency's biggest ever operation was specifically targeted at the Albanian organised crime group Campania Bello. Inevitably, this has led to some myths and misconceptions about how these groups operate. The first is that there's some kind of single shadowy organisation operating as the Albanian Mafia.
The reality is that rather than being kind of these very hierarchically organised, tightly disciplined structures that we saw, for example, with the Italian Mafia organisation, what we have instead is more kind of regional-based, clan-based, family-based networks.
The other great myth about the Albanian organised crime groups is that they are uniquely violent and brutal.
If you cross them, they're going to use violence. Kidnapping, taken away, not to be returned again, they'll just make it disappear.
There's no doubt that Albanian drug traffickers use extreme violence. But every drug trafficking organisation uses violence. In an illegal marketplace, this is pretty much the only way to enforce contracts and intimidate rivals. But the idea that Albanian criminal groups are uniquely violent in ways that other traffickers aren't really just feeds into familiar cycles of misinformation that go back decades in the war on drugs.
The way that the operations of these groups is presented is that the success, as it were, of specific trafficking organisation or criminal groups is determined by their proclivities to violence. In the case of the Albanians, what we're seeing is instead of this ability for violence, it's more the capacity for entrepreneurship, a willingness of mobility, a capacity to move around globally.
Of course, some Albanian criminals are often happy for people to think they are ultra-violent killers, which can lead to groups like the Hellbanians in the UK, who literally advertise their trigger-happy narco-bling lifestyles and in music videos. But the real power in Albanian drug trafficking isn't held by street-level gangs like the Hellbanians, but by sophisticated, tightly controlled trade networks that stretch over continents. Because in reality, the Albanian traffickers haven't achieved power primarily through starting wars with other criminal groups, but through forming business relationships with them.
God bless Albania. We keep good relationship, otherwise there is no hope. Goes from Colombia with the big boats, sometimes come to Albania. From here we go Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia.
When the Albanian crime groups do inflict violence, it's very often to maintain internal discipline, rather than fighting other groups over territory. This is helped by the fact that wherever in the world they operate, their workers can be controlled through threats of violence against their families back in Albania.
Kapet një nga policia, zem për shembull, kapëm unë nga policia, do vi një tjetër mas radhës time. Shumë thjesht, sepse ti ke një familje këtu, dhe normalisht do pash të shqiptojnë ato. Për mua është më mirë që ty unë në Hamburg se sa ty familja ime ndhe.
And of course, as so often in the war on drugs, the ability to buy and sell politicians and cops is as important as the ability to buy and sell cocaine or heroin. What most empowers the Albanian organised crime groups is that they're deeply woven into the country's ruling class.
Former Minister of the Interior, Samir Tahiri, received a 3-year sentence for abuse of power. The court found he had inexplicable links to a distant cousin convicted of trafficking 3.8 tons of drugs to Italy.
I think what's problematic for Albania is that they've actually tried very, very hard to be a good and compliant partner. Because EU membership, accession to the EU has been, the real push for successive Albanian governments.
Illegal drug trafficking is ultimately just a business. And the Albanian organised crime groups have taken over the industry not by being sociopathic monsters, but simply by being more efficient and innovative business people than anyone else. And by killing a fair few people along the way.
Who do you buy it from?
I have an Albanian friend that I go to.
Albanian?
Yes.
What's different about him compared to other dealers?
Ooh, so much more efficient.
And as long as these drugs remain illegal, it is these types of business people who will continue to thrive and make billions.
We'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs.